For those who want information on that new series, after source number 8, there's a link on your sheets. There you can find the flyer for the new series. It's called The Jew of the Future. It starts next Wednesday. It is in my base of operations, Yeshivat Or Chaim of Boys High School, vacant of the high schoolers. So the information is all there. The address is there. If you can sign up online, that would be great because it helps plan the space. It's a free series, 4 parts, the Jew of the Future. So let's talk Napoleon now. What we're going to talk about in this abbreviated time, and that's one of the reasons I gave you so much text on the sheet, will be so that people can look up some of the material afterwards, and I won't have to say everything out loud. But what we want to talk about are major elements in Napoleon's interactions with the Jews in France and the broader French Empire, 3 approaches to explain why Napoleon was so positive in his message that he gave to Jews. Remember, there's a series on Philo Semites. Then we'll talk about why Napoleon was harsher to Jews in France than Jews elsewhere. And I don't think we're going to get to it, but I'd like to get to the response of Jews to Napoleon's overtures. So we start out with a classic story. I heard this growing up in summer camp quite a bit. And it's in source number 9. This is from a website called Mostly Kosher. It's someone's blog, but you can see this story in any number of places. He's actually quoting a version of the story that appears on Aish.com. The story is told that Napoleon was walking through the streets of Paris one Tisha B'Av, right, the day when Jews commemorate numerous historical disasters, but principally the destruction of the 2 temples in Jerusalem. As his entourage passed the synagogue, he heard wailing and crying coming from within. He sent an aide to inquire as to what had happened. The aide returned and told Napoleon that the Jews were in mourning over the loss of their temple. Napoleon was indignant. How come I wasn't informed? When did this happen? Which temple? Presumably he said it in French. The aide responded, they lost their temple in Jerusalem on this date 1700 years ago. Napoleon stood in silence and then said, certainly a people which has mourned the loss of their temple for so long will survive to see it rebuilt. It's a beautiful story. Really nice. Totally false. But, first of all, 1700 doesn't work at all, because in the year 1768, Napoleon was born. So I'm imagining he wasn't also, walking in the streets, I think. It's also, at least this version of it has it happening in Paris. I've seen a version of it that it happened in Jerusalem. Napoleon never actually went to Jerusalem. He did invade what we call Israel. In those days it was part of Syria, Ottoman Empire, and so on. But he actually doesn't go to Jerusalem for political reasons, because he doesn't want the Muslim population to see him as a Christian crusader. So he never invades Jerusalem. But the story is a fascinating story. Couple that story with source number 10. A fellow by the name of Dr. Alan Hertz. Does anybody know about him? Very interesting. Yeah, you do. Okay. So for those who don't, jump to number 13, please, so you know who we're quoting here. Alan Z. Hertz was senior advisor in the Privy Council office serving Canada's Prime Minister and the Federal Cabinet. Formerly worked in Canada's Foreign Affairs Department, earlier taught history and law at universities in New York, Montreal, Toronto, and Hong Kong. Studied European history and languages at McGill, then East European and Ottoman history at Columbia, MA and PhD. Also has international law degrees from Cambridge University and the University of Toronto. Just settle down a little bit. What this tells you is that you're talking about somebody who's intellectual of standing. This isn't just somebody writing, and I say it because he is the principal voice I'm going to quote from his research related to the following proclamation. Take a look at source number 10. From an essay of his, Jews, Napoleon, and the Ottoman Empire. In 1819, Napoleon also remembered that the French Revolutionary Army... backtrack. I'm going to give you a chronology of Napoleon's career. We're going to come back to that. This is just an opener right now. But in 1819, he is in exile, his second exile. In 1819, when he's writing in his diary, Napoleon also remembered that the French Revolutionary Army had in early 1799 sent Jewish agents to Damascus and Aleppo. The implication was that their mission was to secretly gather intelligence and discreetly stimulate local Jewish support. Perhaps linked to one or more of these agents is a pitch-perfect document that, without payment or other financial reward, first surfaced in 1940 London. Originating from Nazi Vienna, it was an elderly Jewish refugee's last-minute typescript of his family's long-treasured handwritten German translation, said to be derived from an earlier text, perhaps partly in French and partly in Hebrew. This is the purported letter to the Jewish nation from the French commander-in-chief Bonaparte, dated April 20, 1799. In that specific year, that date was notably the first day of Passover. There was also a covering letter said to be from Aaron, son of Levi, rabbi of Jerusalem. Both letters claimed to be written from Jerusalem, falsely identified as the site of Napoleon's headquarters. In the context of the revolutionary doctrine of self-determination, right, that every population should be free, should be able to participate in government, the alleged Napoleon letter puts great emphasis on Jewish peoplehood. It describes Israelites as lawful heirs to their ancestral land and encourages them to hasten home to reclaim their patrimony. It also quotes from the Catholic Old Testament that offers extravagant rhetoric lauding the revolutionary French Republic. The alleged rabbinic letter refers to building a temple in Jerusalem and calls to arms all able-bodied Jews no matter where they live. So, the legend goes. Number one, Napoleon is sympathetic to the Jews' grief for their long-lost temple and believes it will be rebuilt. And number two, in World War II, a document surfaces without financial incentive, it's not someone trying to make money, purporting to be a translation of Napoleon's proclamation saying that the Jews have a right to return to their land in Israel and to govern themselves. Now, square that. We're going to come back to that document and whether there's any evidence that it ever existed. But square that with source number 11. Professor Alyssa Sepinwall, Napoleon, French Jews and the Idea of Regeneration. At the same time, there were more nefarious aspects to Napoleon's treatment of the Jews. Most notably, he reversed the universalism of the French Revolution, we'll talk about that, and made French Jews work to demonstrate their fitness to be equal. Moreover, he often referred to them negatively, calling them a contemptible and degraded nation, capable of the lowest deeds, and a vile people, cowardly and cruel. So how do you square this? And these are quotes. This we know, he said. So the question is, how do you square this? Does that mean that the first stories are false? What can we do with it? Again, I'd like to make this a discussion, but I won't just because we don't have the time. So, basic facts. First of all, the status of Jews in France before Napoleon's time, their situation is similar to that of other Jewish communities in Western Europe during the Enlightenment era. There's persecution. There was a wave of people trying to civilize the Jews by giving them rights, saying that if we give them entree into society, they'll be able to become like other people. They will improve. Example, the Edict of Tolerance of Emperor Joseph II in Austria in 1782. France, during the French Revolution, issues the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It doesn't include Jews. We were not full citizens, therefore we did not have the benefit of those. However, those freedoms eventually do trickle down to the Jews, so that in 1790, the government of the Republic proclaims rights and freedoms for Sephardic Jews, and in 1791 for Ashkenazi Jews. Yes, there was a difference. These were different populations, largely in different geographic areas within France, and the Ashkenazi Jews were known more and accused more of usury, of money lending at serious interest rates. They liked the Sephardi Jews a lot more, and therefore the Sephardim got their rights in 1790 and the Ashkenazim in 1791. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Napoleon himself, though, born in 1769, actually, in Corsica. Corsica had just been acquired the year before from Italy by the French. His parents were minor nobility there, but there was no wealth in the family. If you notice the spelling of Bonaparte with the U in it, Bonaparte, that was Corsican spelling. He would later drop that initial U. He goes to a military academy, rises swiftly, becomes a captain at the age of 23. In the year 1778, Napoleon's just 9, Louis XVI declares war on England. He has a problem, though. He's broke. They have no money, right? For people who know the French Revolution, this is old hat, but since I grew up in a school system that didn't really teach us these things well, I'm repeating some details for anyone who was like me. In 1789, so Louis XVI convenes this broad Estates General, this broad assembly, but it's not yet a national assembly, made of three different groups. First estate are the clergy, second estate are the nobility, third estate are the commoners. And the idea is to use them to create laws which would provide, in the end, more money for the government. The last time they had met was 1614. It had been a while since they had met, and some things had changed. Specifically, the Enlightenment. What you could get away with in 1614, you couldn't get away with in 1789. The idea that the clergy and the nobles are going to combine with their forces to outnumber and outweigh the third estate, the commoners, and get them to go along with things, that's not happening in 1789 in France. The idea that the commoners had to wear different robes marking them as commoners and had to enter from a different entrance and be subservient to the clergy and the nobles, that's not going to go anymore. And so the third estate revolts. They get locked out of the room. They end up meeting on the tennis court. There's a tennis court oath for anyone who's interested in tennis. But the bottom line is that they form a national assembly over Louis' resistance. They want a constitution. They get a constitution. They storm the Bastille Castle. The nobles and the clergy renounce their privileges. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which we mentioned before, is adopted. This is all 1789, 1790. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette are imprisoned, and the monarchy is abolished. While all this is going on, Napoleon is in military school. He's already become a captain. He becomes a general in 1795 at the age of 26. 1796, 1797, he conquers Italy, makes a treaty with Austria, heads a French expeditionary force to invade Egypt in 1798, Battle of the Pyramids, for those who have heard of that. There's a coup d'etat against the Directory of the Republic in 1799. Napoleon is established as the first consul for a term of 10 years. Conveniently later on, that becomes consul for life. He makes a pact with the Catholic Church during this period as well, and becomes basically all-powerful. So, let's go back now to Napoleon and the Jews. That's just quick chronology so we know the years that we're talking about for Napoleon's rise. So, the Jews again have received rights, 1790, 1791, within France. 1796 seems to be the start of the idea that Napoleon actually promised Jews that they would be able to come back to their land in Israel, settle there, and build up a society there. And there is some evidence to support it. I mean, some elements of the proclamation that we read are clearly false. He never entered Jerusalem, as the example that I mentioned earlier. And historians are really skeptical, because Napoleon liked to write down his thoughts, and he spent his time in exile writing his memoirs. And he never says, I wrote a letter to the Jews saying, or I made a proclamation saying Jews get to go back to their land. You have nothing explicit. But there is evidence to support it. First of all, we do have some accounts from 1799 that sound an awful lot like there was a proclamation. And the research that I'm quoting on this is probably 90% Alan Hertz's work, as you'll see in what I quote on the sheet. Take a look at number 14, please, from his paper on this. The world seems to have known little or nothing about the letter to the Jewish nation dated April 20, 1799. But way too soon to have them originated from distant Ottoman Syria came remarkable European tidings about an apparently earlier, undated, and perhaps entirely unrelated Napoleonic proclamation to the Jews. The latter news perhaps reflects the proclamation to the Jews the Turks had heard about, and we'll talk about that, in the months before September 1798. Two or three writers of the last 30 years have referred to an alleged April 1799 report, most appropriately from Constantinople, from the Ottoman Empire. This news from Turkey was said to have been perhaps initially published, maybe early May 1799, in the Gazette de Hamburg, a city that was neutral during the War of the Second Coalition against Napoleon. Such vague references are hard to verify directly because it's hard to find 1799 copies of the Gazette d'Hamburg. They're just not around. I looked in the Vaughan Library system and I couldn't find it there. I didn't check University of Toronto. But let us turn our attention to the press of Berlin. I underlined for you just the geographic locations we're talking about here. Berlin, the capital of another neutral power in Prussia. You get the following report. Constantinople, April 22nd. In several African and Asian places, Bonaparte has issued, as it is called, a proclamation to the Jews for the restoration of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Then, a report in the papers in London. Bonaparte, it is said, where is it, number 14 still? I'm just jumping within it. Bonaparte, it is said, has published a proclamation to the Jews dispersed in Africa and Asia, inviting them to restore the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And then from a French newspaper, May 22nd, 1799, would be the Constantinople report. But April 17th, Bonaparte arranged for publication of a proclamation in which he invites all the Jews of Asia and Africa to come line up under his banners in order to reestablish ancient Jerusalem. If this proclamation never happened, why is it that in short order we're finding it discussed in Prussia, in Berlin, in France, in England? Reports of these are showing up. Now, the French report, the last one that we quoted here, in truth is just copied from the other reports. It seems not to add any information. But as Hertz notes in the last paragraph in source number 14, this was a paper that was basically a spokesman or a mouthpiece for Napoleon's own government, for the directory of the revolution. And because of that, whatever they're publishing has the official green light. Napoleon is approving this message that's going out there. Diane, is it...
Well, why Africa and Asia and where in Africa?
Right, so Africa and Asia, I was thinking as I read through this, that it was because they wanted to avoid saying Europe. In other words, not to create the image of the Jews of Europe fleeing there, but instead the Jews of North Africa, the Sephardic Jews from there, Jews from that region, the Middle East is really what it's talking about. It's not talking Japan and China when it says Asia. This is the Middle Eastern focus. So, sorry? Turkey is a big piece of this, and I'm going to get to that. But we have, what I'm trying to show you here is we have accounts in German media, in French media, in British media, suggesting that this is going on, and these accounts are roughly contemporary to when this would have been when it would have been proclaimed, I should say. Not only that, the Turks had heard of such a proclamation. We talked about something from Constantinople. So I brought you, in number 15, Hertz's quote from a middle of the 19th century Turkish historian. This fellow Ahmed Pasha was as he puts it here, a towering intellect within the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 19th century. Bernard Lewis, for those who are familiar with his work, praises Ahmed Pasha and his history. And this fellow Ahmed Pasha records in the second paragraph of number 15 that it was heard from the mouth of a Jew that, as understood from a printed and published official declaration, Jews from all over have been invited to agree on establishing a Jewish government in Jerusalem. The Turks think that this is going on, that a proclamation has been issued. And it makes sense, because he gave rights to Jews when he conquered lands. When he conquered Italy, when he conquered Malta, he liberated the Jews. In Italy, he got rid of the Jewish ghetto. In Malta, he took the Jews, as well as the Muslims, who had been enslaved to the Christian population there, and he liberated them and gave them the right of worship. In March of 1799, he comes to Jaffa, and he meets with Jews there who view him as a savior. They don't think this would be inconsistent with his actions. Overall, when he conquered areas, he liberated the Jews who were there. Not only that, his advisors recommended it. He had an advisor by the name of Thomas Corbett, who was an Irish, who was a leader in Ireland, and he argued for liberation of the Irish, the Poles, and the Jews. That was what he pushed for Napoleon. But take a look in particular at the following quote, which I brought you in number 16. Another reflection of the public's fascination with the Egyptian campaign was information which fellow director Merlin D., I don't know how to pronounce that, got from Commissioner Francois, a senior official in northern France. Francois troubled to report a conversation with a Jew from Germany. According to the latter, Europe's Jews viewed Napoleon as the Messiah, whose coming would trigger the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. We'll talk about that more at the end, I hope. The German Jew also said that 1.5 million Jews were awaiting Napoleon's signal to leave for the Mideast. The counsel from Commissioner Francois was simultaneously strategic and skeptical. Quote, "One can derive a great deal from these people by flattering their religious prejudices. I leave it to your wisdom either to work to develop this idea if you think it of some value or to just laugh it off as a joke." So he's getting advice saying take advantage of these Jews and their desire to be in the land, and that is advice given to him in February of 1799, 2 months before the alleged decree. So what we have is, number one, we have accounts of such a proclamation in the media of the time. That's number one. Number two, he gave rights to Jews in lands he conquered. Number three, his advisors are in support of the idea, at least some of them are, and we do have certain statements by Napoleon that support this. So as an example, I brought you in source number 17. As an exile on St. Helena, Napoleon carefully read the back issues of Le Moniteur. He would thus have been reminded of the proclamation mentioned in the publication in May 1799. That was the French report about his proclamation. Nonetheless, his own account of the campaign said nothing about issuing a proclamation to the Jews, but very much to the point. Napoleon then chose to refer to the Jewish agents sent to Damascus and Aleppo, and to quote a vague hope that was animating local Jews when spring arrived in 1799. Writing in the third person, Napoleon says, "News was circulating among them that after taking Akko, Napoleon would present himself in Jerusalem where he would reestablish the Temple of Solomon." He is writing, he's aware that Jews are anticipating this. More, what Napoleon himself had probably been thinking back in 1799 was perhaps revealed more clearly in Paris in the year following his return from the Mideast. As first consul, he told the Council of State in 1800, "If I governed a nation of Jews, I would reestablish the Temple of Solomon." That's pretty good. Napoleon had there been making a broader point about governing to please the majority as the way to recognize the sovereignty of the people. Thus, in this important democratic context, he chose to rhetorically offer posterity the startling hypothesis of a majority Jewish country centered on the temple in Jerusalem. There is reason to think that he actually did it. Can't prove it. Don't have a surviving document, and we have lots of surviving documents from his time. This isn't there. So you don't have the smoking gun, so to speak. But ask yourself, is it so strange to think that he actually issued such a letter with all the background that we have here? Something to think about. More concretely, though, fast forward to 1806. Because until now, we've been talking about Napoleon and Jews who were not French. Right? Jews in Italy, Jews in Malta, Jews in the Ottoman Empire. Jews in France don't have the same experience. We already alluded to that in Alyssa Steppenwall's piece. We're going to come back to that. But in 1806, Napoleon moves against French Jewry on issues of money lending. And he issues a decree which I quoted for you in source number 18. I'm grateful to Google Translate, which I had to adapt a little bit, but for the most part I got it right. But basically, there were complaints within France about Jewish money lending, and he issued a decree, which you see there, suspending debts owed to Jews for 1 year. Not commercial debts, but private debts. If somebody was a farmer and had borrowed money from a Jew, he says that's suspended for a period of 1 year, and he establishes something called the Assembly of Jewish Notables. How many of you have heard of the Assembly of Jewish Notables? Okay, this is really important information. This is the sort of thing that I wish I had learned about in school. And I didn't. But this is of tremendous importance. If you look at source number 18, I'm not focusing on the usury part right now. I'm focusing on the third paragraph in number 18 from that decree. These circumstances, the complaints about Jewish money lending, have at the same time made known to us how urgent it is to revive, among those who profess the Jewish religion in the country subject to our obedience, the sentiments of civil morality which unfortunately have been amortized in too many of them by the state of abasement in which they have languished for a long time, a condition which does not enter into our intentions of maintaining or renewing. The Jews need to become civilized. So he comes up with a way to do that. Source number 19 from the classic historian Jacob Katz. Lending an ear to the complaints of Alsatians that Jews still clung to the old attitudes in spite of their new status as citizens, Napoleon decided to tackle the problem at the root. He expected the Jewish population to adapt themselves to their new situation, to give up their unique institutions, such as rabbinical jurisdiction, and to be ready for amalgamation with their environment, even to the point of intermarriage. This led him to convene an assembly of Jewish notables from France, Italy, and French-occupied Western Germany. Here, laymen and rabbis discussed the issues put to them in the form of 12 questions on behalf of the emperor. We'll come back to the questions. In the course of the deliberations, Napoleon realized that whatever the decisions of the assembly, they would not be binding for the Jews, unless they were sanctioned by a purely religious authority. There were rabbis in the assembly, but he wants something more than that. He wants a rabbinic body to say, this is okay. This gave rise to the idea of calling a Sanhedrin, consisting of religious leaders and rabbis. The assembly, however, turned out to be a rather conservative body as far as its rabbinical members went, and they alone counted in terms of religious authority. In other words, they didn't go along with everything that Napoleon was proposing. But this is Napoleon's strategy in 1806. He wants to create an assembly which is going to get the Jews moving in terms of civilization. That's what he wants to have happen, and he includes other instructions. In number 20, take a look from Professor Sepinwall. When he called the assembly's successor body the Sanhedrin in 1807, Napoleon offered further instructions about the kind of regeneration of the Jewish world he expected, and the special measures he now planned for the Jews. These included 10-year restrictions on money lending, as well as a requirement to local governments that for every 2 marriages between Jews that they authorized, a third needed to be a Jewish-Christian intermarriage. I don't know how that works. Just like on a practical level, I don't know what that looks like. We need a lot more estricas. I don't know how this plays out. But look at his 12 questions in source number 21. Is it lawful for Jews to marry more than one wife? Right? He wants to know about loyalty to the state and to French civilization. Is divorce permitted by the Jewish religion? Go ask King Casimir. No, can a Jewess marry a Christian, or a Christian woman a Jew? Or does the law only allow Jews to marry amongst themselves? Right? That's always one of the big questions about Jewish mingling within society, if not the biggest question. Do Jews regard Frenchmen as brethren or strangers? In any case, what duties does their law prescribe to Jews towards Frenchmen who are not of the Jewish religion? Do Jews who are born in France and are of the legal status of French citizens regard France as their fatherland? Is it their duty to defend it, to obey its laws, to accommodate themselves to all the provisions of the civil code? Will you honor the law? Who nominates rabbis? That's a good question. I wanted to know the answer to that. What police jurisdiction do the rabbis exercise over the Jews? Will you listen to the police? Are the forms of election and jurisdiction of the police magistrates laid down by the Jewish law or merely consecrated by custom? Are there any professions prohibited by Jewish law? Does the law forbid Jews to practice usury in dealing with their brethren, right, as opposed to non-Jews? Does it forbid or does it allow them to practice usury in dealing with strangers? Very targeted, pointed questions are put to this assembly of Jewish notables. What happens with their response is something I want to come back to at the end, and I'm realizing I have 7 minutes left to get to the end. So we'll see how this works. We'll figure something. Really. In 1808, Napoleon creates what's called the consistory system in France. Before the French Revolution, religion had been powerful in France. The Revolution de-Christianized it. They wanted no religion. But Napoleon reversed that stance in 1801, 1802. He recognized Catholicism, he recognized Protestantism, created levels of administration that would be funded by the state, and it was a way of imposing the authority of the state over the authority of religion, co-opting religion. So Jewish reformers, a fellow by the name of Isaac Jacobson, another one named Isaac Bear, wanted that for the Jewish community. They said, we want to have a consistory system, a system in which you have a system of government funded and recognized by the government, via which decisions will be made. And Napoleon granted it, except that we'd have to fund it ourselves. We don't get government funding. Sounds like the French Catholic schools, right? If you take a look at number 22, you'll see the decree there establishing the consistory. The job of the consistory was to govern and to promote civilization, that's the term, among the Jews. That was the requirement. Ultimately, it included ensuring that the decisions of the Sanhedrin that he expected were going to support the civilizing influence would actually be taught in the Jewish schools, would be taught in sermons that the rabbis would give in their synagogues. And that was this consistory system, which still exists down to today, without the decisions of the Sanhedrin, I think. But the government does it in order, again, to help civilize the Jewish community and to gain the support of the Jewish elite, so to speak. You put them in positions of power on the consistory, now they'll support the government. Same day as he creates the consistory, Napoleon issues what becomes known as the infamous decree, which I brought you here right after source number 22. For reasons unknown, I forgot to put a number there. Maybe it doesn't deserve it. It's infamous. But looking at what's there, you see limitations on where Jews will be allowed to live. Limitations on Jews' ability to practice various trades. They will not be allowed, if they're conscripted into the army, they're not allowed to hire a replacement, which was common in society for those who could afford it. These are all 10-year decrees. Notice the last line in number 19. The Sephardic Jews have not given rise to any complaint. They don't engage in illicit traffic. None of this applies to them. Sephardic Jews are okay. Ashkenazic Jews are the problem. But you get this very harsh decree. Also, at that time, I should note, Napoleon issues a decree a couple of months later requiring fixed first and last names. That's the famous decree that Jews have to have the same system of naming that everybody else is using. There was a particular list you could choose from. There were rules. You couldn't use an Old Testament name. Interestingly. Yeah, go figure. One wonders, I wonder at any rate, I don't know, whether that had to do with the growth of Yiddish names. If you lose the right to use Old Testament names, then maybe that's where you go, is Yiddish. I don't know. But here's the question. On the one hand, he's wonderful to Jews in Malta. He's wonderful to Jews in Italy. These places that he invades, he's wonderful to the Jews there. And in France, he's issuing these restrictive decrees and talking about how we need to be civilized. Why is this going on? So in terms of why he helps us in broader areas, it's not love of Jews. That's very clear from the quotes we brought in the beginning. It's very clear from what he did in France. It's not religion. He's not a religious man. He says that explicitly. He says to the Muslims, I appear to be a Muslim. To the Christians, I appear to be a Christian. He's using it for political benefit. The clear idea here, in terms of whom he helps, is political benefit internally and externally. Internally, because remember the context in which he operates. It's the French Revolution. Liberté, equalité, fraternité, all these ideals. He needs the support of the revolutionaries. In the same way, for those who were at the series that I did at Beth Emek, we talked about Dostoevsky, and how at one point he wrote in favor of Jewish rights because he wanted to be accepted by the left. Napoleon wants the support of the revolutionaries, and so he talks a good game about liberating Jews. He has to, because he's also fighting the French Revolution. You can't be pro-revolution and declare yourself emperor. Right? The two don't really go together. Making a deal with the Catholic Church reversed what the revolution had done. So he needs to throw them a bone. So the bone is, we conquer areas, I'll liberate these oppressed populations. But that's one piece of it. A second piece of it, though, and most fascinating, is that he wants to undermine the Ottoman Empire. He had a practice when he conquered areas, and I brought you sources to support it in a few of them here. The Ottomans complained about this to him in source number 23. He had a practice of establishing printing presses in the local language. He ordered printing presses that could write in Arabic characters. He wanted to undermine the Ottomans by speaking to the subjugated populations or the minority populations and promising them greater rights. And so he sends letters and he sends spies, we talked about this in the beginning, within the Ottoman Empire to the Jewish community saying when Napoleon comes, things are going to be great. Whether he ever promised that we would get Israel and Jerusalem is beside the point. He promises them rights. And so there is the issue of internal political support by the revolutionaries. There's the issue of external political support among those nations he hopes to conquer. But there's also the hunger for glory. We know from his own statements he wanted glory. He talked about liberating the Greeks, this ancient people that once was so grand, and now they are subjugated, and I'm going to liberate the Greeks. He saw glory in his activities in Israel. I brought you in source number 24 that Napoleon wrote a letter in February 1799, a report. He said, when you read this letter, it is possible that I might be on the ruins of the city of Solomon. Never mind, he didn't actually go there. Regarding the Syrian campaign, he reminisced later on, I constantly read Genesis when visiting the places it describes and was amazed beyond measure they were still exactly as Moses had described them. He never saw Tel Aviv. He has this hunger for glory, and he wants to be seen as a liberator. I brought it in number 25 as well from Melissa Goldstein-Steppenwall. If you see the quote there, at the end of number 25, completing their regeneration thus promised to add to the image of Napoleon as a figure who combined the attributes of Moses, the Messiah, and indeed God himself. It's a glory thing for him. So he has political gains and he has glory. So why didn't that help with local Jews? Why didn't that help for the Jews who were in France? So, yeah.
The answer is right here in the sheet.
Yeah.
The Jews in France were Ashkenazi, and all those other countries he conquered most likely is...
Right. So I wondered about that possibility, whether the answer was that these Jews he's conquering in Italy and in Malta and the Ottoman Empire are all Sephardi, and maybe he just likes them more. We don't know about any rights that he's granting to Jews in Germany. So it's an interesting idea for sure. I haven't really seen it discussed in the literature, but I wouldn't discount it. But on Sunday evening, I was at a wedding and had an opportunity to talk to Professor Ken Green, for anyone who knows him. And he's going to be giving a course on modern Judaism, so I wanted to pick his brain about this issue. And his answer to me was Napoleon was a conqueror, not a liberator. And I think that's really true. Meaning, he's going by what will serve his interests for conquest. That works outward. He's not conquering France. And his goal is not to liberate people. That's not what it's about. He's not in this game in order to free people. The glory is nice. But at the end, he's in this game in order to acquire. And the Jews in France are already acquired. He doesn't have to do anything for them. Just the opposite, he needs to appease his population. And I think this plays out on two levels, expanding on Professor Green's idea. Number one, it plays out on the individual level. He wants to ensure the happiness of his citizens who are complaining about the Jews. Professor Steppenwall in number 26 proposes something very interesting, which I'm going to summarize because we're already at time. She talks about how there were three approaches in this era to the condition of the Jews. There were, on one hand, the impossibilists. People who said, you can never reform the Jews. Forget it. They can't be rehabilitated. Then on the other hand, you had the unconditionalists. People who said, there's no way that you can do this by imposing conditions, accept the Jews, and it'll be great. And then in the middle, you had the conditionalists. People who said, accept the Jews, give them rights, but contingent on dropping usury, contingent upon being good citizens. The French Revolution was promoted by people who took an unconditional approach. It may have taken them longer than for everybody else, in terms of giving rights to everybody versus giving rights to the Jews, but by 1791, they've given us our rights. And there's pushback. Napoleon sees pushback from people who say the Jews are lending us money, the Jews are not really blending into society, they're not really converting for those who have been pushing conversion, and they say, Napoleon, you can't do it. And so what Napoleon is doing is he's reacting to the unconditionalists by imposing conditions. He's trying to satisfy his non-Jewish population by rehabilitating the Jews on a more robust level. And on an administrative level, it's part of Napoleon's desire to impose the state on religion. That's why when you look back at the 12 questions, he has so many questions that center on how is marriage going to work. Leave aside the intermarriage question, but how is marriage going to work? Do you obey the laws? Who appoints your rabbis? How are you governed? It's about imposing the state upon religion. So that's why Jews have a harder time in France than elsewhere in the empire. In France, Napoleon is interested in keeping his people, so to speak, happy, and if it comes at the expense of the Jews, so be it. He has nothing to gain from us. And number two, he wants to impose the state over religion, and that's going to involve restrictions on our rights. So Napoleon does help the Jews in the broader empire, but it's hard to live as a Jew in France. He's imposing restrictions where the French Revolution had liberated. Now, Jewish reaction to Napoleon. I want to highlight three issues. For those who have to go, I totally understand. We said till 11 o'clock, but I'm going to take another couple of minutes just to at least introduce 3 points. First of all, the impact of the Sanhedrin is fascinating. The assembly of Jewish notables, their answers were relatively liberal, trying to satisfy Napoleon's expectations. We don't have time to go through the specific responses, but the assembly was very liberal. They wanted to say that, no, intermarriage is not a problem. We weren't allowed to marry the Canaanite nations, but we were allowed to marry non-Jews in general. The money lending, no, we would never lend money and charge usurious interest. Only there's a difference between commercial loans and private loans. They tried to find ways to appease Napoleon. They talked about, not only are we citizens, but in the recent battles we saw that Jews would be on the French side, and they would see Jews on the other side, and they would still fight against them, even though those were Jews across enemy lines, because we are Frenchmen first, we are Frenchmen of the Mosaic persuasion, and so forth. The Sanhedrin, the group of rabbis who are convened afterwards, are led by a Rabbi David Sinsheim, who walks a line between tradition and answers that will be acceptable to Napoleon on almost all issues. Jay Berkovitz writes, and I brought it for you in number 28, that it's very interesting to see what they did, for example, to the answer on intermarriage, where the Assembly of Jewish Notables comes out with a very liberal answer. The Rabbinic Sanhedrin says that a mixed marriage creates civil obligations, but from a religious standpoint, it's not a halachically valid marriage. They say what they wish to say. Berkovitz's point in general in his essay is to say that the Sanhedrin did not give Napoleon as much ground as people usually think. People usually talk about this as a group that gave Napoleon everything he wanted. It's not so. The assembly was more flexible. The rabbinic body was less so. But here's what's particularly interesting. When you watch the flow of reform after this, France and Germany chart different paths. Reform takes root in the beginning in Germany, right? In Berlin, in Hamburg, in the early 19th century. In France, on the other hand, it takes a lot longer, and it's a lot weaker. Why? The populations are not so different. But Napoleon forced the question. By putting these questions to a political body, the assembly, and then a rabbinic body, the Sanhedrin, he effectively set up what was in bounds and out of bounds. Because you've already had your leaders give you answers to the questions of the day. And that defines the debate for basically the next century in France. Germany doesn't have that. So they're going to revisit everything from scratch. And all options are open. In France, the terms have already been set via this deliberative body. I brought it for you, a little bit of it in source number 29, so you can see it there. But that's number one. In terms of Jewish reactions, he has an unexpected reaction in that he has already set up framework, and in some sense it's a limiting framework, for the development of reform in France in the next 100 years. That's number one. Number two, even though Jews in many parts of Europe and into Asia and into North Africa were fans of Napoleon, the Jews in Israel were actually very afraid. Why? Because they're afraid he's going to lose. It's all well and good for him to talk about liberating us. But what happens if the Ottomans think of us as a fifth column? They think of us as betraying the Ottoman Empire. So they went to great lengths, and I brought it for you in source number 30, they went to great lengths to convince the Ottomans and their leaders and their Arab neighbors, oh no, we're not at all on the side of Napoleon. We are praying. We had a prayer gathering at the Western Wall in order to pray that Napoleon should be defeated. You can see it there. They worked in bolstering the defenses. They're very afraid of Napoleon's arrival, and that's a second sort of unanticipated result. And then third was a great split in the Jewish world about how to view Napoleon's impact on Jewish religion. Specifically and especially among the Hasidim. Beyond France, you had some who welcomed the emancipation they expected Napoleon to extend throughout his empire. So I gave you references in source number 31 to pages in the great book, The Jew in the Modern World. He brings there a sermon given by a rabbi in New York, talking about how Napoleon is going to be a great liberator for the Jews. It can bring in a messianic time and so forth. And he wasn't the only one who thought that way. However, at the same time, it was a lot more complicated in the Hasidic world. I mentioned this briefly when we did the anti-Semite series that I did. For some of you, you were there. The first Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, was active in opposing Napoleon. He ran networks of spies, people who got information about French troop movements, and then he had them passed to the forces of Tsar Alexander. Not because he was afraid Napoleon is going to cause us to look bad in the eyes of the Russians. We were suffering horribly at that point under the Russians. It wasn't that. Rather, it was because he was of the belief that if Napoleon emancipates and liberates Jews, that's the end of religious observance for a large swath of the population. He said, I would rather that we suffer and not have to have this kind of emancipation that Napoleon is promising. Others disagree. I should emphasize, no one in this debate loved suffering. No one loved poverty. But it was a question of whether you valued more the survival of the Jewish people as you saw it, or their economic improvement. And he took the stance that absolutely, he was jailed for it. Anyway, he was jailed for other things. It's a longer story. But he took a stand and said, you have to pray for the success of the Russians over Napoleon. And there were others who were staunchly against. It's really worth looking into. I recommend. If we had time, I would have brought more about this. But it's a fascinating thing. So what we see, to summarize it in 30 seconds, we talked about the extremes of legend about Napoleon. On the one hand, the Tisha B'Av promise you'll have your temple rebuilt, and the story of this proclamation that Jews will govern in Israel and build their temple. And then on the other hand, his insults to the Jews in his own public statements and writings. And we suggested that it's true. Beyond the boundaries of France, Napoleon had many reasons for being positive. And there is evidence to support the idea that he issued such a proclamation. It would gain him political support and potentially gain him glory, to be seen as a liberator. However, within France, helping the Jews wasn't in his best interest. It was much more about appeasing the local population who were frustrated by the unconditional emancipation of the Jews. And it was about imposing the state over the religious structure of the Jewish community. And so he convenes the leaders to try to get them to ratify his conditions for Jewish life in France. And he issues the 10-year ban on money lending and so forth. Fundamentally, the Jewish world doesn't really suffer much from Napoleon because Napoleon in the end is defeated. And many of the rights that Jews had initially received due to the French Revolution that were issued in different lands by Napoleon are restored after some period of years early on in the 19th century. So the emancipation happens, opposition to Napoleon or not. There's much more to be said. Obviously, I apologize for rushing this. It would have been good to be able to add a week, but as I said, I don't have the luxury in terms of my schedule. But thank you very much, and now I can thank in person Rabbi Grover for enabling us to have the sessions. Thank you very much.